It didn't take long for the villagers to notice the change in Jenny. She had once been the bright-eyed girl who greeted everyone with a smile, but now she was distant and withdrawn. Her clothes, which had once been neat and clean, now hung loosely on her thin body. Her once bouncy hair was dull, and the spark in her eyes had faded. The other villagers began to talk among themselves. They could see that Jenny was suffering, but no one knew what to do. They didn't know about the coldness that came from Halima, or the lack of food that Jenny faced when her father wasn't home. They only saw a girl who was slowly fading away, and it troubled them deeply. Old Mrs. Zainab, who lived at the end of the street, was one of the first to notice. She had known Jenny since she was a baby, and she remembered how much joy the little girl had brought to the village. Mrs. Zainab had also known Salim for many years. He was a good man, and she respected him for his hard work and devotion to his daughter. But she had begun to see that things had changed since his marriage to Halima. One morning, as Mrs. Zainab walked past Salim's house, she saw Jenny sitting on the steps, her head down, staring at the ground. Mrs. Zainab paused and walked up to her. "Jenny, my dear, are you feeling all right?" Mrs. Zainab asked softly. Jenny looked up, but her face was pale, and her eyes were empty. She forced a small smile. "I'm fine, Mrs. Zainab." The old woman didn't believe her. She could see the sadness in the girl's eyes. She placed a gentle hand on Jenny's shoulder. "If you ever need anything, child, you come and see me. Don't be afraid to ask for help." Jenny nodded, grateful for the old woman's concern. But she didn't know what she could ask for. She couldn't tell anyone about the way her stepmother treated her. She couldn't tell them about the hunger, the coldness, the loneliness. She had nowhere to turn. That evening, after Mrs. Zainab's visit, Jenny felt a small glimmer of hope. She wasn't alone. The village cared about her, even if it felt like no one did. It was a small comfort, but it was enough to help her keep going. As the days passed, Jenny continued to suffer in silence. She had learned that Mr. Omar had been away for some time, visiting relatives in a nearby town. But one evening, as she was walking along the beach, she spotted a familiar figure. It was Mr. Omar, returning from his trip. He was walking slowly, his cane tapping against the ground as he made his way down the road. Jenny's heart lifted. She ran toward him, a smile spreading across her face. "Mr. Omar, you're back." The old man looked up in surprise, and his face lit up when he saw her. "Jenny, my dear, I've missed you," he said, his voice filled with warmth. He opened his arms and gave her a hug, something she had longed for since he had left. "I've missed you too," Jenny said, her voice cracking slightly. She felt like she could finally breathe again. Mr. Omar pulled back and looked at her closely. His eyes softened with concern as he saw how thin she had become. "Jenny, child, what's happened to you? You look so weak. Have you been eating?" Jenny lowered her head, feeling embarrassed. I haven't had much to eat lately." Mr. Omar's face grew serious. "Is it your stepmother? Does she not feed you properly?" Jenny hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. She had never told anyone about the way Halima treated her, but now, in the safety of Mr. Omar's presence, the truth spilled out. She doesn't care about me. She gives Sehar and Amina food, but I only get scraps when Father isn't here. I'm hungry all the time." Mr. Omar was silent for a moment, and Jenny could see the sadness in his eyes. "I'm so sorry, my dear. That is no way for anyone to live." He took her hands in his and looked at her with determination. "From now on, I will make sure you are cared for. I'll bring you food every day, just like I used to." Jenny's heart filled with gratitude. "You don't have to, Mr. Omar. You've already been so kind to me." The old man smiled gently. "It's no trouble, my dear. You are like family to me. No one should go hungry, especially not someone as kind and hard-working as you." From that day forward, Mr. Omar made sure Jenny always had enough to eat. Every evening, when Salim was out on his fishing trips, Jenny would sneak over to Mr. Omar's house and enjoy a warm meal. She no longer felt alone, and the hunger that had gnawed at her for so long began to fade. But Jenny knew that things at home would never be the same. She still had to endure Halima's coldness, but now she had someone who cared for her. That, she realized, was worth more than all the food in the world. Word soon spread throughout the village about Jenny's suffering. People began to take notice of how Halima treated her stepdaughter. The other villagers, who had once been silent, now felt a responsibility to help. One day, the village leader, Hakim, called for a meeting. He had heard of Jenny's plight and decided that something needed to be done. The villagers gathered in the square where Hakim stood before them. "People of this village," Hakim began, his voice calm but firm, "we cannot allow one of our own to suffer in silence. We must stand together as a community and care for each other. It has come to my attention that one of our own has been mistreating a child. Halima, you are responsible for this child's well-being. Why have you allowed her to suffer?" Halima stood frozen, her face turning red with shame. The entire village was watching her, and for the first time, she realized that everyone knew what she had done. There was no escaping it. Hakim continued, "If you cannot treat this child as your own, then I must ask you to leave this village. We will not tolerate cruelty in our community." Halima opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She felt small and helpless under the village's gaze. Finally, she dropped her head in defeat. I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I've been wrong." Jenny, standing in the back of the crowd, felt a weight lift off her shoulders. For the first time, it seemed like justice might be done. She didn't know what would happen next, but she felt a flicker of hope in her heart. After the village meeting, the air in Salim's house was tense. Halima had been forced to confront the truth about how she had been treating her stepdaughter, Jenny. The confrontation in front of the villagers had left her feeling embarrassed and ashamed. It had also opened her eyes to the pain she had caused. That evening, as the family gathered for dinner, Halima sat quietly at the table, her gaze fixed on her plate. Salim, noticing the shift in her demeanor, said nothing at first. He had seen Halima angry before, but tonight she seemed different, more subdued, more regretful. Jenny sat across from her, her eyes avoiding Halima's. It had been a long time since they had shared a peaceful meal together, but something in the air felt different now. Jenny wasn't sure if she could forgive her stepmother, but she could feel a change, a subtle softness in Halima that hadn't been there before. Finally, Halima spoke, her voice softer than usual. "Jenny," she began, hesitating for a moment. "I am sorry for how I've treated you." Jenny's heart skipped a beat. She looked up slowly, unsure if she had heard correctly. "What?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have been harsh and unfair to you," Halima continued, her eyes meeting Jenny's for the first time in a long while. "I know I've treated you differently from my daughters, and for that, I apologize. I promise, from now on, I will do better." The sincerity in Halima's voice surprised Jenny. It was hard to believe that this was the same woman who had made her feel like an outsider for so long. But part of Jenny wanted to believe her, wanted to believe that things could change. Jenny nodded slowly, her heart still uncertain. I don't know what to say," she replied. Salim, who had been listening quietly, smiled and placed a hand on Halima's shoulder. "Thank you for saying that," he said gently. "I know it hasn't been easy, but I believe we can move forward together." The room fell into a quiet, uneasy silence. It wasn't the end of the story, not yet, but it was a beginning, a small but important shift. Days passed, and the change in Halima became more noticeable. She no longer ignored Jenny, and for the first time in a long time, Jenny found herself sitting with Halima and her two stepsisters at the dinner table, eating a full meal alongside them. Halima made sure to include Jenny in family activities. She would ask her about her day, smile at her when she helped with the chores, and even made sure to set aside food for her at meal times. Jenny could hardly believe it. There were still moments of awkwardness, and Halima's treatment was not always perfect, but there was a clear effort to do better. Jenny didn't know how to feel. Part of her was skeptical. How long would this change last? But part of her was also relieved. She didn't have to sneak away to Mr. Omar's house anymore. She didn't have to hide the fact that she was hungry. Halima was trying, and that meant something. Over time, Jenny's health improved. She regained some of the weight she'd lost and felt stronger. Her cheeks flushed with color again, and her energy returned. She smiled more often, and the light in her eyes slowly came back. Sahar and Amina also started to treat her more kindly, and though it took some time, they eventually became friends. They played together, laughed together, and helped each other with the chores. It wasn't perfect, but it was a far cry from the coldness Jenny had once felt. One evening, as they all sat together in front of the house, Jenny realized how much had changed. The warm light of the setting sun bathed their small cottage in a soft glow. Salim, Halima, and the girls were all together, laughing and talking as the day ended. Jenny glanced at her father, and then at Halima, who was smiling at her. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she belonged. She felt like she was part of something, a family, a community. It was a feeling she hadn't experienced in years.